The book I've chosen to review is Media Literacy, New Agendas in Communications, edited by Kathleen Tyner. I selected this text because many of the chapters relate to new media literacy and technology integration in education, which is my particular area of interest and research. My interest in digital literacy stems from my school board's intense focus on 21st century teaching and learning and my own need to adapt my teaching practices in light of how technology is changing the students I receive and the world in which they will enter. The book is divided into 4 parts. 1. Literacy in action, media literacy in community-based settings. 2. Views from the K-12 classroom, media literacy in formal education. 3. The next generation, media literacy in higher education. And 4. Beyond the classroom, media literacy in virtual environments. I have chosen to focus here primarily on the last section, media literacy in virtual environments, as these chapters address gaming more specifically. The first chapter in this section, Media Literacy 2.0, Unique Characteristics of Video Games by Aaron Delwich, proposes the case for an analytical framework for assessing video game content, similar to such frameworks that exist for the analysis of film, television, and advertising. Delwich argues that video games' persuasive power lies within 4 areas: immersion, engagement, identification, and interactivity. He argues that to become literate as a gamer, one must teach through games rather than about games. He defines gaming literacy as understanding the 4 characteristics of games, while also reflecting on design and production choices made by game designers. This, he argues, requires understanding of not only the consumption of the media, but also its production. Delwich also argues against getting hung up on ludology versus narratology when analyzing games. Instead, he argues for critical reflection on the part of the medium's audience. Now a closer look at his proposed framework. The first domain is immersion. He argues that immersion within a game creates the ability of designers to manipulate sight, sound, touch, and even proprioception, and that it has the effect similar to propaganda. Immersion can control emotions and beliefs, and creates a disconnect from the reality outside of the game's narrative. The second domain, engagement, is characterized as flow state, or very focused concentration, time distortion, a sense of control, and satisfaction from the activity. Delwich argues that this kind of engagement is what makes video games so desirable to educators, because it offers points of reflection on cognitive processes. Identification refers to players' psychological and bodily identification with avatars and the game's narrative. He cites G, stating that the power of video games is within the way they meld learning and identity. Interactivity refers to the player's interaction with virtual objects and the narrative, as well as the judgment-behavior feedback loop. It also pits the player's objectives against the game designer's objectives. Finally, Delwich argues that for students to become literate in video games, they must also create those games. The next chapter, New Media Literacies by Design, the Game School, looks at a proposed curriculum designed with gaming principles in mind. Like Delwich, Alice Robertson argues that to be literate in a medium, one must investigate consumption and production, but also participation. One of the most salient points happens on page 193. It isn't always the case that newer technologies necessarily enable new ways of learning. It may be that some of the tools are new, and they might enable new forms of production, but what matters most in New Media Literacy's framework is how community of producers makes those tools meaningful to themselves and their audiences. The key here is that learning, cognition, knowing, and context are all intertwined. The remainder of the chapter describes a curriculum proposed for New York public school system called Quest to Learn, which would be designed around gaming literacies. Social interaction and critical reflection are key learning outcomes within this system. The curricular design is centered around interpretation, creative production, and situated contexts. The curriculum focuses on 7 ways of knowing: systems-based thinking, interdisciplinary thinking, user-centered design, specialist language, meta-level reflection, network literacy, and productive tool literacy. The main design strategy for this curriculum is using media literacy as a lens for other content area as opposed to a content area in and of itself. In lieu of traditional curriculum design focused around units and lessons, it's envisioned instead as quests and missions that are centered around guiding questions that last year long. The goal here is meaningful participation and acceptance within their own community. It's also key to point out here that game-based learning is not focused on a particular form of media or technology. It's an underlying design principle within the curriculum. The last chapter of the book is Augmented Reality Gaming and Game Design as New Literacy Practice. It looks specifically at the example of an augmented reality game called Dow Day, which looks at real historical events around the Vietnam War in the physical environment that they actually took place in. The game makes use of GPS technology to guide students around the University of Wisconsin-Madison to collect information related to the protests in the 1967 protest against Dow Chemicals. Some of the features of the game include role play. Players are asked to play the role of a journalist investigating the events leading up to the protest. It uses GPS technology and takes place in the real locations of the real events. It incorporated primary source historical documents and interviews. Players conduct virtual interviews with key figures, collect and read documents, and view video clips and photographs. The game does not end there, though. The unit of study that accompanies the game includes players redesigning and critiquing the game, and eventually designing their own games based on similar principles. Some of the challenges faced by the game is that players developed historical thinking skills, but didn't see the construction of reality within the game, the design nature of the game, and the bias. The critiques of the game focused mostly on gameplay and the interface. The author cited 2 key issues for new media literacy illustrated by Dow Day and the accompanying curriculum. 1. Supporting design thinking, and 2. Supporting sites of collective intelligence. Finally, the authors hit upon a key issue in digital and media literacy. Much of the current discussion around mobile devices in schools centers on how to keep students from using them during the school day. My hope is that this attitude is starting to change.